It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 21. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and we take a look at the headlines in creationism from the past week. This week we have camels, horses, and red pandas. Oh my! More fun with the ICR logo, and a young solar system? That and more coming up. Let's kick it off with creation.com, or Creation Ministries International, and look at a couple articles that they have published in the past week that revolve around the theme of baraminology. That would be how organisms are classified in the creationist context of biblical kinds, and so the definition of a kind. And we can get one little hint from this particular article. Does Leviticus 19:19 prohibit crossbreeding of horses and donkeys? And why did they ask that question? Well, that's actually a reader's question that was sent in, and Joel Tay responds to it. And so he's responding to one particular reference in Leviticus 19:19, where it says, you shall keep my commandments, or my statutes. You shall not let your cattle breed with any different kind. You shall not sow your field with two different kinds of seed, nor shall you wear a garment of cloth made of two kinds of material. And so this sounds like pretty, specific definition of kinds, right? It seems to be very exclusive. Very closely related things are considered two different kinds of material. So how does that relate to things like, donkeys and horses, or donkeys and zebras, or horses and zebras, which, creationists are saying are the same kind of organism? And if they're the same kind of organism, then, why is it being suggested in the Bible and, really Judaic interpretation, historical interpretation, that some of these animals aren't allowed to mate with each other, even though they can mate? Now, that question is an interesting question, but I don't want to get into that. I want to point out the part of the response that Joel Tay has, which is relevant to our broader question that we often address when talking about creation, is how do they define a kind? And he's rightly pointing out, one of the first things he points out is that Leviticus 19:19, the word which I just read as kind in there is translated our English word kind, is a different Hebrew root word than the word kind or mean used in Genesis 1. And so if you just open up your English Bible and you read kind here in Leviticus, and you read Genesis 1 and 2, right, and you read about kinds there, or Genesis 9, and you read about kinds coming on the ark, this is not the same, stemming from the same term, even though our English word is the same. And so Joel's right. You need to understand the original language in order to be able to interpret this word. And so this word kind, it does refer more specifically to things you might think of as variations or variants within even possibly a species. Moving on, Journal of Creation. CMI published this on their website today, even though it was from their 2020 issue. So what happens is the Journal of Creation is their sort of peer-reviewed journal with various articles, and then as those are published, eventually they make their way into, at first they're kind of exclusive, right? You have to purchase an annual subscription in order to get access to the newest issue of Journal of Creation. But then over time, they eventually sort of, push them out onto their website. So eventually you'll be able to see all the articles from Journal of Creation, even if you don't subscribe. Although, if you want the hottest and latest thing, you need to subscribe to get the latest news. So here we are back in this 2020 article, Hierarchical Clustering of Dinosaur Baraminology Studies. Okay, so there's that word baraminology again. Is Archaeopteryx a part of the same baramin as land-based dinosaurs? This is a really interesting question, I think important question for young Earth creationists. So Brian Thomas, Joel Tay, Matthew Cesarti tackle this, and they're using something called statistical baraminology, which is a statistical method of comparing lots of different traits, and you end up with sort of like these heat maps that suggest relationships or similarities, I guess probably more appropriately, similarities between different organisms, which can be interpreted as different baramins or original created kinds. And the question here is, I'm just going right down to the conclusion because it'll show you the quandary that young Earth creationists are in this particular case. So reading right there from the conclusion, baraminology studies may sometimes give results that might intuitively seem incorrect. All right, so saying you look at the organisms and you may think that they're related to each other, but baraminological studies sometimes give us results that don't fit your intuition. For example, in the previous analysis of 3 dinosaur datasets, Archaeopteryx was classified as a member of the terrestrial dinosaur baramin when it has anatomy for flight. All right, I mean, I understand this. Individuals that would look at something like Archaeopteryx would obviously be attracted to their flight capacities, right? The feathers and the wings, and be immediately drawn to saying this is a bird, and classify it as a bird. And yet their baraminological analysis tends to want to place it in the dinosaur baramin, or the broader group of dinosaurs, because it has a whole bunch of anatomical features that are dinosaur-like versus modern birds. From the Bible, we know that birds were created on separate days than terrestrial dinosaurs. Therefore, they must belong to separate baramins. Now, see, it's probably something many people haven't thought about, but this would be a criteria that's an interesting application of a criteria, right? You've got birds being created on day 5 and animals being created on day 6, or mammals being created, or reptiles and mammals being created on day 6. If they're created on different days, well, then obviously they can't be part of the same kind. They have to be one or the other. And so this is why I think there's so much consternation or discussion and talk in creationist circles about how to classify these dino birds, right? They have to fall on one side or the other. Even if they put them in their own separate, which is what happens in this paper, they're going to put them in a separate baramin, a separate created kind, but they still have to decide which day they were created on. So are they in with the birds because they had flight capacity, or are they in with the dinosaurs because they seem more like land animals? But for most of their audience, intuitively, right, it's going to feel like they should be a bird, and therefore created on a completely different day. So as they point out, feathers provide a clear anatomical separation of class Aves from class Reptilia. Well, okay, they're saying that provides a clear separation, but then all their analyses suggest that it's not actually a clear separation, right? Because they get these animals that have feathers, but they end up in their statistical analysis being dinosaurs, which would put them as reptiles, but reptiles are made on a different day. All right, so now they come to applying the extended entropy filter plus the hierarchical clustering algorithm to the BDIST method corrected this. Furthermore, this method, okay, so yeah, don't ask me what the extended entropy filter is, because the methods section was extremely short in this paper and actually refers to another paper, which I didn't bother going to look up. But what I find interesting about this is that clearly there's a problem, right? There's intuitively in the paper they draw like different statistical analysis, even baraminological analysis have placed these organisms in different groups, different baramins, depending on which set of characters and how you weight them. So now they're just saying, well, we're going to apply this extended entropy filter plus this hierarchical clustering algorithm. And when we do that, that corrects this. Now, what do they mean by correct it? Well, it corrects it back toward maybe our intuition, right? That keeps them in the birds rather than in the dinosaurs. And they are a distinct type of bird, so they're in their own baramin, but at least we can say they may have been made on one day versus the other. it feels like it feels, again, I haven't looked up the statistical method to see how valid that might be, but it sure feels like, wow, we have a problem here, so let's just keep trying new stats until we get something that corrects things back to the way we already think that they are, letting the data guide them to a solution. All right, sticking with creation.com, I'm only showing this about pterosaurs really have feathers. Again, we just talked about feathers on Archaeopteryx. So did pterosaurs have feathers? A video again by Joel Tay disputing the evidence that some pterosaurs might have had feathers. Now, the report that pterosaurs may have had feathers was not like flight feathers like you think of on modern birds, or even on Archaeopteryx, but would have been proto-feathers or keratinaceous extensions from the skin, which are the beginnings, I guess you could say, of feathers. All right, so it's another question of like, okay, they're pterosaurs are kind of, they're flighted animals, right? So they were created in day 5. So why not? Why couldn't they have feathers? This has always confused me about young Earth creationism. Here, this past article says is that feathers are a clear demarcation of aves, birds, from everything else. But birds, there are many, many different kinds of birds. God created them all separately, and then gave each one of those separate kinds feathers. Why would God need to? Why couldn't God have put a feather on a pterosaur? Why couldn't God have made a particular frog have feather-like or downy-like covering instead of the skin that they have? If you don't have an actual connection by common ancestry, and so you inherit traits by synapomorphy, shared derived traits, and that's not the means by which you are. If it's not an evolutionary process, I guess is what I'm trying to say more simply, then there's nothing stopping God from using characteristics similar to other kinds of organisms, because he clearly does that, because there's a bunch of kinds of birds that are separately created and yet they have similar features. But what I'm actually pointing out here too is that in case you didn't know it, on creation.com has a YouTube channel, and they've been more working on their production there, and they have This Week in Creation.com talk, and so these are. I think this is kind of started as, in response to, not in response to, recognizing the Answers in Genesis has a popular show on Mondays and Thursdays in which they have members of their organization sit down and just go through various news items, kind of like I'm doing with This Week in Creationism, and then talking about them. And so this is their kind of response to that. But they take on like a single topic per episode. All right, let's go to Institute for Creation Research, and we'll have a little bit more fun with them. I just want to remind you, if you've seen previous episodes of this, we've talked about their incorrect logo, having the left-handed twisted DNA molecule, and then they switched it to a right-handed one, obviously because of the reaction that they got from it. And I've said that to me, this isn't a huge deal. I found it just kind of humorous, but I'm not, I think it's an understandable mistake. But I just want to point out that this isn't an easy transition, right? They put a lot of effort, I'm sure, into the design for their logo change. And then once they did that, right, when you're going to roll that out, I'm sure this was prepared months ahead of time. And then they're rolling that out right around the new year with a big splashy, like, hey, this is what we're doing. And we're rebranding ourselves in some senses, like refocusing our research, and we're going to change our logo now. And I said, it's not actually that easy just to make the switch. Sure, it is on the web. But here you see the problem. All right. So here is a recording of one of their podcasts, which is after the first, and you'll see they've got the got the left-handed DNA molecule here, right, on the screen. Now, I think this is actually a digital placement because everything behind them is digital as well. So maybe that's not a physical, and so that maybe they should have been able to switch that out. You notice that their YouTube station up here has the right-handed molecule, so that's been switched. But more, I found it more interesting that here he is drinking out of a cup with the left-handed molecule. So that tells you that they had gone as far as to make a bunch of merchandise, right? And probably had all of this merchandise ready to go in the Discovery Museum book, store, all right, and to sell online and so forth. And so there is, that's not something you can change immediately. So I think they're going to probably be drinking out of these cups for a while with the left-handed molecule. I went to the bookstore because I thought, I'd like to pick up one of those cups that has the left-handed molecule, just kind of like as a curiosity for myself, for my office. But I come to discover when I went there, either they never had them, they hadn't pushed them out yet, or they've taken them all back, and all you can buy is the old logo, on everything, and there's nothing with the new logo on it yet. So I guess they're still working on that. Although on the page itself, they have the corrected, down here they have the corrected molecule. All right, sticking with ICR. Oh, so here's a newsletter or a worksheet for kids, Creation for Kids. And they just published that this week, right? End of January, early February. And look what's on here. The left-handed DNA molecule. So they had already made this worksheet, probably already sent it out in physical copies and newsletters. And here they have a PDF of it. And so, it's everywhere, right? It's going to take a little while for them to replace this logo with the corrected logo. Hey, I had to mention this particular worksheet because, here it is, Creation Kids, our young solar system, right? Want to teach your kids about our solar system and its history. And so here you get the extremely simplified bullet points of what are the best arguments, right? That would be the simplest to understand for why the solar system is young. And I'm always astounded when I see these lists. All right, so here you get your 4 check marks over here. These are your 4 things that tell you that the solar system is young. And when I look at lists like this, I'm always amazed. I was like, that's the best that they could come up with? These are the most compelling? I don't think kids are going to understand any of these. And they're really bad examples of a young solar system. I've written about several of these. Lastly, I just want to mention the Creation Research Society. I don't think I've talked about it on This Week in Creationism to this point. The Creation Research Society was begun by Henry Morris in 1963. It consists of a group of, I'll say, credentialed scientists, meaning they have PhDs and master's degrees, whose focus is providing scientific evidence for a young Earth and a young biosphere. Their primary contribution to the broader creationist community is this peer-reviewed journal they published every quarter. It's called the Creation Research Science Quarterly. And in it are found probably some of the most technical articles in creation science. And these articles would be read mostly by other creation scientists and used in producing materials that they might then push out to the general public, all right, or the person in the pew following young Earth creationism. And so it's an important journal in that sense, that it's kind of the trendsetter. It's the place where really the important topics of creation science are discussed. In recent years, it's focused more on biology than geology, although, I don't know, maybe it's still an even split. This is where you'd find your articles on the flood boundary, right? Where does the flood begin and what demarcates the end of the flood, and all those types of debates. But also a tremendous number of articles devoted to baraminological studies. And so just as we've already spoken about statistical baraminology, different methods for doing baraminology, how to identify kinds, all those types of things are discussed in this particular journal. This particular issue, I was most interested in this article, Classification of the Enigmatic Red Panda based on Molecular Baraminology. So there's an example where the red panda sounds like a panda, right? So, and pandas are bears, and just very generally, people have thrown red pandas into the bears originally, just based on gross morphological analysis hundreds of years ago, or even in the last 100 years. But now that we have molecular analysis and we've taken a much closer look at its anatomy and physiology, we realize that the red panda is really a really unique, interesting organism. And it's not as crazy looking as, may say, something like a platypus, but it doesn't really fit with any other kind of organism, kind of like a platypus doesn't feel like it fits with any other organism. And so this is a case where here you have a young Earth creationist doing additional molecular studies, which is really downloading sequences and reanalyzing them with their own type of statistical baraminological analyses, and deciding that the red panda really belongs with the mustelids group and is in that particular baramin. Why it can't just be in its own baramin, it's actually not clear to me from the article, because there are clearly enough differences between the red panda and other groups. And as far as I know, the red panda certainly can't reproduce, right? It can't cross with any other kind of animal that we know of today. And for some creationists, that is the primary feature of a kind, right? That the inability to mate would be an identifier of what makes a kind a kind. And so even something like the red panda, apparently we can still even argue about that. Creationists still can't figure out exactly what a red panda is in terms of, did God make red pandas? Or are red pandas simply the descendants of another, of a kind that didn't look anything like a red panda, but still resulted in red pandas after the flood? Yeah, it's just one article like that after another in this particular paper or particular journal. All right, and lastly, just your weekly reminder that Answers in Genesis has the answers for you. If you go to the Ark Encounter, you'll see this display, 1,398 animal kinds, right? Now, actually, they don't mean there are only 1,398 animal kinds, because what they really mean is there's 1,398 vertebrate, land-dwelling, air-breathing animals, because those are the only ones that were specifically called to be on the ark. And so that's what 1,398 animal kinds means. So I think they're going to confuse their audience to some extent, because they're just referring to animals. But the broader point is that although the Ark Encounter put out a tweet that said current estimates from our researchers place that many there, if you go to the Ark Encounter, yes, you can read the fine print and find out that these are estimates, but it gives the impression of, we figured it out. This is how many animal kinds there were on the Ark. But as we've already discussed, young Earth creationists have a great difficulty defining exactly what a kind is, and then actually applying definitions to real-life organisms like red pandas to figure out what kind they actually are. Are they a separate kind, or are they the same kind as something else? So clearly it is an estimate, and it's an estimate with a huge amount of variation around it, despite the appearance at the Ark Encounter of being of them having a lot of confidence in their number. All right, that's it for this week. Thanks for hanging out with me. I have to admit, wasn't the most exciting week in creationism, but maybe next week will be more interesting. We'll see. I just have to wait and see what comes out, and we'll talk about it together at that time. All right, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.